Let's get started. Our first lecture looks at families in historical perspective, although in truth, it's very hard to talk about what families once were and what they are now, because across human history, from country to country, culture to culture, and community to community, the average or ideal family has changed dramatically. Even in the history of just the United States, within the past 300 years or so, we see tremendous variation. When many Americans think of the word family, they picture a mom, a dad, and one or more biological kids all living together in the same household. Maybe throw a few pets in there too. That's the kind of family that's most commonly shown to us on television and in the movies. We call that kind of family a nuclear family or a conjugal family. Conjugal family is the term the book uses. Nuclear family is also used. And nuclear is like nucleus of a cell. It's separated from the rest of society. If you went from what you see in TV and the movies, you'd assume the nuclear or conjugal family was the most common kind of family in the United States, or maybe even the world. But you'd be wrong. Married heterosexual couples with 2 or more children, like The Simpsons, now constitute less than 10% of all American households. Historically, and in many parts of the world still, extended families, which refer to households that consist not just of the conjugal or nuclear family, but of other relations too, such as grandparents, aunts and uncles, or cousins, are more common than nuclear families are. Extended families may be more common among certain ethnic groups in the United States than others too. For example, Hispanic and Asian families are more likely to care for elderly parents and grandparents in their own homes rather than relying on formal nursing home care, at least compared to blacks and whites. So an extended family that includes 1 or more care-dependent elderly grandparents, along with their adult children and grandchildren, may be more common in Hispanic and Asian American communities. One kind of family that's becoming increasingly more common in the United States is the single-parent family, which is a single adult with 1 or more children. Some single-parent families happen as a result of divorce. About 40 to 45% of all marriages in the United States will end in divorce. That's something we'll talk about later in the semester. But many are also the result of the birth of a child to a single woman. According to the CDC, 40.3% of all children in the United States are now born to single mothers, although 60% of those are mothers who are living with their child's father. Some of those single mothers will eventually go on to marry the father of their children or someone else. 26% of U.S. children live in a single-parent household at any given time. 75% of those are female-headed. The rest, 25%, are headed by single dads. Patchwork families, or step families, are formed when divorced or single parents enter into new relationships. Not everyone has kids. Currently, heterosexual couples who are married and have no kids make up 21.4% of all American households. Cohabiting heterosexual couples. Cohabiting people are people in a romantic relationship who live together but are not married, make up 2.14% of households. For gays and lesbians, the percentages are lower. By the way, 37% of gay-identified adults will have or raise children at some point in their lives. We'll talk about that in greater detail later in the semester. Interestingly, though, the most common kind of household in the United States isn't what we would think of as a traditional family at all. The most common kind of household is a single adult household. Such households comprise about 28% of the U.S. population, according to the last census, and include either a single person or, in some case, a single person living with roommates. If you are unmarried and live alone or with roommates, you are part of the most common type of U.S. household that there now is. If family forms and households are diverse, marriages and romantic relationships are no less so. The most common form of marriage in the United States, and the only one legally recognized, is what we would call a monogamous union. Monogamy just means being married to only one person at a time. It can also refer to being sexually active with only one person at a time. This kind of marriage can be between a man and a woman, or more recently, in all 50 states, monogamous marriages between 2 men and 2 women are also legally recognized. Monogamous marriages aren't the only kind there are, though. Polygamy is a form of marriage wherein a person is permitted multiple spouses. The most common form of polygamy worldwide is polygyny, in which a man is allowed to have more than one wife. Many biblical marriages were polygynous, and it's still practiced in some cultures. The UK newspaper The Independent reports that in Senegal, for example, nearly 47% of marriages are said to feature multiple women, and among the Bedouin populations of Israel, it stands at about 30%. Polygyny happens in the United States, too. The FLDS, or Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, a breakaway sect from the Mormon Church, still unofficially practice polygyny. Former FLDS prophet Warren Jeffs was reported to eventually have married as many as 70 women. This picture shows a picture of him with some of them. But, like I said, this kind of marriage isn't recognized by the government in the United States, though it might be recognized by some churches. In case you're wondering, some cultures do practice the flip side of this, although it's rarer. Polyandry is a form of polygamy where a woman is allowed to have more than one husband. Some communities in Tibet, for example, have practiced a form of polyandry in which several brothers would be married to the same woman, who would have equal sexual access to all of them. This was done in order to minimize the division of scarce land. Here is a picture of a woman shown posing with her husbands and their children. Your assigned reading goes into changes in marriage and family forms across history and in different cultures in a little bit more depth. I don't want to repeat all of that, though you should know it. But one major change in how families are formed that is relatively recent and will be the subject of the rest of this lecture is the idea that people should be free to choose their own marriage partners, and that that choice should be based on love. The concept of the ideal marriage as a love match is a relatively new one. To us, the idea that someone has the right to choose their own spouse, and that that choice should be based on love, is pretty obvious. When asked in a recent survey conducted by the Pew Research Center, Americans are more likely to choose being in love as the most important reason to marry someone than any other factor, including more instrumental concerns like financial stability. But in fact, for most of our history, love was not considered an acceptable reason to marry someone, and children rarely had total control over the selection of their future spouse. This was more so the case the more highborn you were. If your family had serious assets or political power, the question of who you married was all about growing your family's assets, getting more land, more money, a new title, more power, influence, or respect. Royalty often had it the worst, because the question of who a daughter or son would marry was one that affected the entire kingdom or country. If Disney movies told the stories of real princesses, they'd go something like this. Once there was a beautiful princess. Her father, the king, was worried because there was a rival for his throne. So he found the richest duke in the kingdom and promised him the hand of his daughter in exchange for a lot of money to outfit armies so that the king could protect his throne. The king was happy because he got to stay the king. The duke was happy because his family was now connected to the royal line, and his grandchildren might someday become kings and queens themselves. The princess was not happy because she hated the duke, who smelled and was 30 years older than she was. The end. To consolidate land and power, European royal families, such as the Habsburgs, often married very close family members, first cousins, etc., for generations. a habit that led to some serious problems related to inbreeding. This picture shows Charles II, who was the King of Spain from 1665 to 1700. Charles's parents, Philip, the King of Spain, and Mariana of the Austrian Habsburgs, were actually uncle and niece. Therefore, Charles was not only their son, but was also Marianne's first cousin and Philip's great-nephew. Charles was born with significant physical and mental disabilities, including a common facial deformity called the Habsburg jaw, where his lower jaw outgrew the upper jaw so extremely that he could barely chew. You can kind of see that in this picture. Charles was also profoundly mentally disabled, was epileptic, couldn't walk or speak until he was 4, and was probably infertile. They tried marrying him off to a number of various royal cousins in the hopes that he would produce an heir, but no luck. He died childless at 38. The throne was up for grabs, and it sparked a bloody war between varying distant relations over who got to inherit it. Even if you weren't a royal, though, the decision of who you would marry was often made by other people, your father, your family, your clergy, tribal or clan leaders, or so on. Speeding ahead in time to the American colonial era, we see this was still the case. Colonial families were usually patriarchal institutions, meaning controlled by the father or the eldest male. A colonial household was often an extended family that may have included not just parents, grandparents, and children, but also servants, lodgers or boarders, and, in some states, slaves, as well as grown children or siblings who had not yet married. A colonial household took so many people to run it, you usually didn't establish your own household until you were married. The patriarch, like the king of his own household, made decisions for everyone else in it, his wife, his children, both young and older, his servants, etc. Fathers were able to exercise control over the marriage partners of their sons and daughters in a number of ways. Boys had to gain the consent of a girl's father before even beginning to court her, so parental influence could be exercised very effectively here. Also, in a farming society, your ability to make a living depended heavily on whether you inherited any of your father's land or not. If you displeased Dad, you risked being cut out of his will, which would leave you landless with few options for supporting yourself. And colonial children were not raised in a culture like ours that valued being independent-minded or thinking outside the box. They were reminded that honoring thy father and thy mother wasn't just what their parents wanted, it was what God wanted too, even when it came to the decision of who they would marry. So why didn't you just let your children choose who they wanted to marry based on who they loved? It was simple. In an era before divorce was tolerated, a marriage had to last for life. Love was considered to be too fleeting, too easy to fall out of, to form the basis of a union that needed to be that durable. A married couple might come to love each other eventually, if they were lucky, but the real goal was mutual respect and long-term stability. Functionalism is a theoretical perspective in sociology that argues that social institutions, like marriage, exist because they serve a function and are necessary for the survival of a given society. Once they stop serving those functions, the functionalist argues, they will eventually die out. Traditionally, marriage was more about serving particular instrumental functions for the couple's extended family and their community as a whole. It regulated sexual behavior and ensured the legitimacy of children. Even in the past, adults understood that their teenage children would become sexually active at some point. You could only control that for so long. So you wanted to make sure that any children born to young women were born into an established marriage where they had both a mom and a dad who was responsible for their support. Marriage also transferred control of one dependent woman from one man to another. In an era before women could support themselves financially, a daughter needed to be supported by her father until she was transferred into the home of her future husband, at which point he assumed responsibility for her. Marriage also created social and political alliances between families and made the inheritance of property more orderly. Even if a man fathered children outside of marriage, those children weren't his legal heirs, which meant they couldn't come to the courts after his death and demand access to some of his assets. That kept communities from having to worry about dividing up farmland between 16 or 17 people who all claimed to be the sons and daughters of a particular individual, for example. Why did love marriage become more common over the past 150 years or so? There are a lot of theories. The readings go into some of them, but one I particularly like points to the role of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, which really began in the late 1700s, was the development of steam technology and mass production or factory production techniques. These things caused major changes in the structure of the family. This is an example of how seemingly unrelated social forces, like changes in the economy, can alter something that seems totally natural or timeless, like the shape of the family. Because of the Industrial Revolution, the economies of most developed nations, like the United States, switched from agrarian economies, where most people made their living as farmers, to manufacturing economies, where more and more people left their families' farmland and moved to cities and towns where all the new factory jobs were. This is a process called urbanization, by the way, when populations move from rural areas to urban ones. Because there are all these new jobs, children no longer needed to inherit family land to make a living. Mass movement from small, tight-knit rural communities to bigger, impersonal cities also increased the freedom of young adults. Think about it. You grow up in a small town, tight-knit, surrounded by uncles and cousins and grandparents and nosy neighbors, and your behavior ends up being a lot more constrained, because these people report back to your parents. They'll gossip. In a city or even a factory town, 3 hours away from where your family lives, nobody knows you. They don't see what you do, and they don't care. Your reputation with your friends starts being more important than with your parents. With declining patriarchal or parental control, young adults now had more opportunity to choose their own spouses. This started a slow shift to a more individualist norm in family relationships. We'll talk about what that means in a second. And the love marriage becomes the social ideal. Not all marriages in the world are love marriages, by the way. An estimated 53% of marriages globally are still what we call arranged or maybe, in some cases, family-guided marriages. Arranged marriage has a particular connotation of someone being sat down by their parents and told, "We found you a husband, you're marrying him whether you like it or not." A lot of people think that arranged marriage and forced marriage are the same thing, and some are like that. But many marriages are more what we might call family-guided marriage, and there is a really wide spectrum. For example, both many Hindu Indian communities and Orthodox Jewish communities worldwide still observe a practice wherein families will hire a professional matchmaker who will come up with a list of acceptable marriage candidates. A Hindu matchmaker might consider things like caste and subcaste, in some cases, professions, education level of both children, the part of India where the prospective bride and groom were born, and horoscopes to draw up lists of suitable candidates. The children will then be presented with a list and will have the option of choosing from that list or continuing to look. UH Chancellor Renu Kapoor is one rather notable Houstonian who's had an arranged marriage. She arrived in the United States in 1974 as the result of a traditional arranged marriage to her husband, Suresh Kapoor, who was an engineering professor and associate dean of the Cullen College of Engineering. By all measures, their marriage is a very successful and happy one, and Kapoor has become the first Indian American woman to head a major U.S. research university. Arranged marriages actually have a lower divorce rate than love match marriages do worldwide. About 6% end in divorce globally, whereas the total U.S. divorce rate is about 40 to 45%. Why? Some argue that this is proof arranged marriages are happier. And maybe your parents do a pretty good job figuring out who would be a good match for you. Maybe in some cases they're even better at determining who would be a good match for you than you yourself would be at the age of 17 or 18. But one reason why arranged marriages might also have lower divorce rates is simply because people who still engage in arranged marriages often come from very conservative cultures where divorce simply isn't an option. So even though they have a lower divorce rate, we don't know that most of those arranged marriages are necessarily happier than love match marriages in a place like the United States. Arranged marriages might be less likely to end in divorce, but if you watch American media, it's pretty clear which type of marriage or partnership we place more cultural value on. Disney doesn't do stories about the happily ever after arranged marriage. The stories we like best are love stories, where a couple is challenged by the fact that their families actively oppose their union, and in which they must defy their families to pursue true love. Romeo and Juliet is like that, West Side Story, The Titanic, and The Little Mermaid. As a culture, we tend to like the idea that we should always follow our hearts, even if other people disapprove, and that true love is worth any sacrifice, even if it means defying or even turning your back on your family or your community. In fact, those are the stories we seem to like best. The United States is a very individualist culture. Individualism is a cultural norm in which the needs of the individual are given equal or greater priority than those of the family, tribe, or group. It is acceptable in the United States to leave a marriage if you aren't happy in it, period. You can also cut off contact with your relatives, with your parents or siblings if you don't like them or if you think they're mean to you. If you do something bad, other members of your family aren't expected to share the blame for it. Adult children in individualist cultures may move far away from home for university or for their jobs because it is acceptable for them to place more value on establishing their dreams or building their careers than staying close to parents or siblings. The motto of the individualist culture is follow your heart. If your heart tells you to move halfway across the world, do it. If it tells you to drop out of society and live on a hippie commune, do that too. And if it tells you to marry a girl your parents don't approve of, then that's fine. Marriage in individualist cultures is love-based partnerships, but divorce rates also do tend to be higher. Conjugal, single-parent, and single-adult households also tend to be more common in individualist cultures. The opposite of individualism is familism, which is a cultural norm in which the needs of the family or tribe are considered more important than the needs of any individual member. In familist cultures, kinship bonds are very strong and considered unbreakable. Divorce is far less common, and extended families see themselves as having the right to discipline other members for the good of the whole. Family honor is a cultural custom one tends to find more highly stressed in familist culture, meaning the idea that what one person does can bring shame to the entire family. Arranged marriages are more common in some, but not all familist cultures, and extended family households tend to be more common. Both individualist and familist cultures have their upsides and their downsides. Being a young adult in an individualist culture can be pretty great because your happiness, your goals, your dreams, your self-development is the most important thing. Being old in an individualist culture can be a lot more difficult and lonely, though, because individualist cultures are less likely to bring elderly parents or grandparents into the homes of their adult children or grandchildren for care. Old age in an individualist culture is often spent alone or in some kind of nursing facility, because having grandma around can interfere with things like having adventures, traveling, developing one's career, or building one's own marriage. The idea that marriage should be an expression of love between two people has had a major impact on our culture. If marriage is based on love, all of a sudden that opens the door to marriages that weren't considered appropriate in the past, because any two people can fall in love with each other. As late as 1967, 17 U.S. states still had anti-miscegenation laws on the books. These were laws that forbade miscegenation, which is the old term for interracial marriage. One such state, by the way, was Texas, which forbade marriages between blacks and whites. Richard Loving, a white man, and Mildred Jeter, a black woman, were residents of the Commonwealth of Virginia who'd been married in 1958 in the District of Columbia. They'd left Virginia to evade the Racial Integrity Act, which was a state law banning marriages between any white person and any non-white person. Upon their return to Virginia, they were charged with violation of the ban. The law also had language forbidding interracial couples from marrying in another state and then returning to Virginia. The Lovings were caught sleeping in their bed in the middle of the night by a group of police officers who raided their home in the hopes of finding them in bed together. That was another crime at the time. Old anti-fornication laws, which forbade sex between unmarried people, were still in the books. In their defense, Mrs. Loving pointed to their marriage certificate, which she'd framed and hung on the wall of their bedroom. She might have done that for just that reason. That's kind of unusual. Rather than defending them, it became evidence that the police needed for a criminal charge, because it proved they'd been married in another state. The couple went to court, and the court upheld their arrest, sentencing them to 1 year in prison, with the sentence suspended for 25 years on the condition that they leave the state of Virginia. They did, but they filed suit in court, and that suit eventually became the Supreme Court decision Loving versus Virginia, handed down in 1967, wherein the Supreme Court struck down all remaining state anti-miscegenation or anti-interracial marriage laws. When the Supreme Court handed down Loving versus Virginia, interracial marriage was still incredibly controversial in the United States. 72% of Americans still opposed marriage between blacks and whites when the Supreme Court legalized it. Support for interracial marriage only hit about the halfway point in 1994. By 2007, 77% of the population approved of interracial marriage. The idea that marriage should be an expression of love between two people had impacts on other kinds of couples besides interracial ones. The two men in the photograph, James Obergefell and John Arthur, were in a committed relationship for 22 years, but unable to marry in their home state of Ohio, which did not recognize marriages between two men or two women. John Arthur was diagnosed with ALS in 2011, which is a fatal neurological disease that paralyzes the body. He was confined to a bed and terminally ill, but the couple decided they wanted to legally marry. They could not do so in their home state of Ohio, so they chartered a small plane that could transport themselves, a nurse, all of John's medical equipment, and the officiant, the person who performed the wedding, John's aunt, to Baltimore, Maryland, where gay marriages were recognized. They performed the ceremony on the tarmac of the runway and returned directly to their home in Ohio because John was so weak. John died 3 months later, 3 months after this photo was taken, but James Obergefell sought to have himself listed as John Arthur's husband on his Ohio death certificate, in spite of the fact that the state at that point did not recognize gay marriage. Ohio refused, and so the case eventually found its way to the Supreme Court. Which handed down its decision in 2015. Obergefell v. Hodges was a 5-4 decision which held that the right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples by the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses of the United States Constitution. It also required all states to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. The Obama administration, which was in the White House at that point, supported the decision and, in celebration, lit up the front of the White House with the colors of the gay rights or gay pride rainbow flag. Interestingly, when Loving versus Virginia was handed down, interracial marriage was far more controversial among Americans than gay marriage was when Obergefell v. Hodges was decided. In 2006, 36% of Americans supported gay marriage rights, but by February 2015, around the time of the decision, 63% of Americans did. That's a really huge change in the space of a little under 10 years. Historian Stephanie Coontz, the author of Marriage, A History, How Love Conquered Marriage, argues that this modern view of marriage as an expression of love between two people has not only opened the door to couples who would never have been allowed to marry in the past, but has also made marriage as an institution, paradoxically, both stronger and weaker than it ever was before. This is an interesting concept. How can basing marriages on love make them both stronger and weaker at the same time? Well, let's look at what we know about changes in marriage over the past 100 years. In 1957, 47% of surveyed couples described their marriages as very happy. That's not even half. By 1970, 67% of marriages were reportedly very happy. So a lot more, 20% more. But the divorce rate had also increased by 50%. How could the average marriage have gotten happier, but the divorce rate also gone up? It's simple. All of those people in unhappy marriages left them. The happy marriages are the only ones who stayed together. So, basing love on marriage makes marriage as an institution both stronger and weaker for a number of reasons. It's stronger because love marriages are often happier than other kinds of marriages, and people now work harder to enrich their relationships and strengthen and deepen their intimacy in a way that was very uncommon among couples of the past. Couples in arranged marriage didn't bother to plan date nights or find ways to rekindle the romance or the chemistry between each other, or go into couples therapy, for example, as often as modern couples do in love-based marriages who want to keep those flames burning. Basing marriage on love has also made it weaker, though, because love is still something you can fall out of. When that happens, many marriages end. One final impact that basing marriage on love has had is that many people marry much later now, if at all. Finding true love is a challenge, and you can spend years looking. You might decide you've never found it. The most commonly cited reason for not being married among unmarried adults is that they simply haven't found the person they're looking for. Only half of adults, 52%, are currently married, down from 72% in 1960. So being single for longer periods of time has become more common. Among 20-somethings, that has declined from 68% to 26%. Think about that. In 1960, 68, almost 70% of people in their 20s were married. Now, it's only a little bit more than a quarter. So, in summary, the question of how love changed marriage includes the following. Marriages are often happier because they're based on love and commitment between two people. People take their relationships more seriously and work harder at them because they feel it is important that they not fall out of love with their partner and that they not let their partner fall out of love with them. Finally, people who would not have been allowed to get married in the past now can, such as same-sex couples or people of different races, because courts and Americans recognize that if marriage is based on love between two people, then, of course, in most situations, any two people can fall in love. However, the flip side of that is that the divorce rate is higher, because when people fall out of love, very often they see that as a reason to end their marriages. Finally, people wait longer to marry or don't marry at all, because a love-based match can be a more difficult one to find. Thank you.